In this lesson, we will contrast the unbiblical philosophy of ecocentrism with the biblical philosophy of theocentrism. First, looking at ecocentrism, which says the universe and all its parts have equal intrinsic value. The problem with this is that it's ultimately a worshipping creation, which is beingless, has no being, so what's the point? Then within this, there's animism, which says all things possess a distinct spiritual essence. So it's basically legitimately believing that inanimate objects have a soul or feelings. The problem is, though, as Aristotle said, or Manav said, that's debated, but whatever, either way, it is true that nothing is what rocks dream about. Rocks have no soul, so they have no mind to dream with, therefore their dreams are non-existent. Then there is flat ontology, which says all entities have equal or the same being and intrinsic values. So an example would be like speciesism, which says it's immoral to prioritize your species' interest over that of another. And this manifests itself in forms like animal air quote liberation, which is ending of animal domestication and ownership. Or think like Fresh Pet saying, it's not dog food, it's Fresh Pet. Well, if it's true, eat it. See, it's all this sort of stuff where you're treating objects and or animals as being equal to human beings. The problem is, though, that this thinking denies clearly observed differences of self-awareness. Self-awareness you can observe of a human being is different than that of a dog, different than that of an ant, and different than that of a rock, which is nothing. And then finally, there is hyper-industrialization, which is hyper-de-industrialization, which is the over-restriction of man's resource usage. A lot of examples include like neo-Luddism, which is removing the products of the Industrial Revolution, like removing factory kind of machinery, including ACs, and certain materials like styrofoam, plastics, and depending on who you ask, even wood products like paper to varying degrees, and promote other things like organic farming, which if you really look into it, it's not organic. And there's green energy where you got solar, wind, and electric power, which electric is not really green, it's mostly powered by coal. These forms of energy, instead of nuclear power or fossil fuels like diesel, oil, gas, as in natural gas, gasoline, or, coal. Then there's agrarianism, which is where you have a non-industrial, farm-based economy and society. And then finally, final example is hyper-conservation, where it's just excessive restrictions for conservation's sake, to where you basically can't even step on a twig and break it or take a rock out of a national park. All of these things with the intent to air quote save nature. But the problem is, though these things are fine in small doses, if you push them too much, if you implement them too much, then it winds up harming mankind. Like all the people in Europe dying from overheating by not having ACs, and which, by the way, mankind is part of nature, so there you go. Well, let's contrast this with theocentrism, which is where God is the center of all thinking and action. Like in Proverbs 3, first part 6, in all your ways acknowledge him, God. Within this, you have what I call biblical vitalism. I couldn't really find a good term for this idea, so if you've seen any of my lessons, you know I like coining my own terms. I can't find a good one, so I call it biblical vitalism, which says that only certain creations, i.e. man and most animals, have supernatural spiritual essence. So a soul, or for animals, a lesser soul. And we see this in Ecclesiastes 3:19. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. So the same breath, meaning spiritual essence, and notice how plants and rocks and all other sorts of things are not mentioned in there. And you think about like sponges and coral don't count as beasts. Then there is hierarchical ontology, which says that there are different sorts of beings. A lot of this based on like differences of self-awareness, as mentioned earlier, and that they then have different levels of value, some being greater than others. And if you haven't seen it, I have a whole about half-hour lesson on this called The Great Chain of Being Slightly Modified. So if you want to learn more about this subject, please go check that out. And we see hierarchical ontology expressed in verses like the first part of Psalm 8:5. It says, "Yet you, God, have made him," this is man, "a little lower than the heavenly beings." So in this hierarchy, man is just below angelic creatures or creations. And then finally, there is the creation mandate, which is man's right and duty to use and take care of creation. This mainly comes from Genesis 1:28, where in it says, "Subdue it," that is creation, "and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So as long as there's not a total net destruction, abuse of creation, we can use whatever resources in any way we want. Again, just as long as it's within reason. And this verse explicitly speaks to domestication.